Alright everybody, we're going to be getting started here in a second, just trying to get these windows lined up. There's a preview for my next piece, for those of you watching this live. There you go, that should do it, although of course OBS decides to be very weird in terms of how these windows are set up. Give me 1 second here. And hopefully OBS will pick it up. It was all good just a minute ago, too. Alright, there we go. Welcome everybody to another episode of Completion Critiques, where we review the achievement and clear rates of games to see what we can learn about player retention and player behavior. I took last week off getting a cavity filled, so we are back with 2 games. This week it's going to be the battle of action, open world titles with Tomb Raider 2013 and Batman Arkham Asylum. These are 2 that I really want to take a look at, as both represent the start of, what will become major franchises, and would go on to kind of define a lot of their respective properties in terms of what we would see. Of course, Tomb Raider being the one that I'm not as much of a fan of compared to Batman. I felt Tomb Raider felt a little too inconsistent in terms of its design and its structure. But I'm most likely in the minority, considering that it went on to spawn 2 additional sequels, and who knows what else is going on with the Tomb Raider franchise. But let us get into things here. It has been a very long time since I played this one, but right off the bat, we can see some issues here with Tomb Raider. That we have certainly lost a lot of people very early into this game. Now, from what it's looking like with these achievements, the game doesn't seem to have too many progression-based achievements, and this is something that we see from certain titles that it makes it a little bit harder to grade, but they still feature very general ones. You know, kill enemies, complete one optional. And these are things that you will most likely do over the course of playing the game. And even with that said, I'm surprised that this game does not feature progression-based achievements. Get through a level, beat a boss, things along those lines. But what's going to be very interesting is that despite having very high churn, it's looking like the game stabilized very high up along those ratings as well. So if we take a look at this, we can certainly see that a lot of the people who bought Tomb Raider did not really make it far in terms of its gameplay. I'm surprised not more people at least completed one optional of the kind of side quest, because that's kind of where the actual tomb raiding comes into play. But looking at these achievements, and again, without having progression-based ones to draw on, it does kind of hurt in terms of giving a fully accurate read. But we will say for this game that it stabilized at 57.2% of its fan base. And this is something that we see from a lot of games, that once somebody is in, they're going to try and do as much of it as they can. So we have, and we'll round it down to 57. Oop, there we go. Which gives us a 43% of churn, which is admittedly very high for this game. And unfortunately, without being able to see too much of the achievement rates, it makes it a little bit harder to gauge what stopped people. Now, Tomb Raider 2013, of course, combined open world, third-person shooting, stealth, and of course seeing Lara Croft get hurt in a lot of different ways. So for people watching this live or recorded, if you did play Tomb Raider 2013 and you stopped before you got to the end, what were the major things that kept you from finishing the game? Some things that I remember when I played this one. One was the dissonance in terms of how the story and the gameplay were playing out. With Laura having PTSD, being scared of killing, and then murdering so many people. And you can see a lot of people got the Gunslinger achievement. So they got over Laura's fear of murder. One of my favorite ones was when she went Rambo with an explosive arrow in like kind of a set piece when she had to like fight off all the mercenaries. But as we go down here, and considering how these achievements are set up, this will probably be one of the quicker segments for our show here. But we have a clear rate of 42.3%, which is actually very high. I did not expect it to be that high. So if we do some basic math, and let me get rid of that decimal point here because we don't need that. So 42 divided by 57 times 100 means we have a core base of 74% for Tomb Raider. And that is really good. We want to see probably like anything above 40% clear rate among the fan base being in the upper echelons of these scores, because we've seen games that have been in 20 to 10%. And I think, again, when we talk about games that have high core bases like this, what it tells us is that there were definitely issues with Tomb Raider 2013. Something honestly stopped a lot of people, 43% to be exact, from playing through this game on Steam. But for the people who stuck with it, it did keep them motivated enough to see the end. I also saw this with Library of Ruina, that it lost a ton of people within about 40 minutes of play, but everyone who stuck with the game, they went all the way to the true ending. I guess it's that whole in for a penny, in for a pound kind of analogy there, or motto. But as we keep going down, curious if there's any 0 achievements. Even some people play this in multiplayer. Somebody actually made it to level 60. I didn't even know Tomb Raider had multiplayer, to be honest with you guys. But apparently it did, and 1.5% of the player base used it. This is very similar to Doom, or Doom Eternal. That even though it was single-player focused, they tried to make multiplayer work, and the majority of the fan base just said, no, we don't want multiplayer. Here's all the skills, and then these are our like 1% achievements. So 8% got everything. And I think part of this about keeping people invested in it is probably the name, Tomb Raider. Again, we've talked about IP and branding before, and people want, or people like to see these major franchises all the way through. And in the future, we'll probably cover the later 2 Tomb Raider games, and it'll be interesting to see whether these achievement rates are consistent across. I have a feeling that when we get to Tomb Raider 2 and 3, it will have less of a churn rate. And the reason why is that the people who are going to be buying the second and third games are already fans. So it's less likely they're going to stop playing a game that they already enjoyed the first or the second game of the franchise. But again, you never know with games like this. But I think with that, this will probably be a very quick one. And unfortunately, it is one of those cases when we have these kinds of games that don't have progression-based achievements. And as we've said before, I think it's a very good idea to have them in your game, even though it may be hokey to have beat Chapter 1, beat Boss 1, get through the tutorial. these are ways of you kind of having a very rough estimate as to how well your game is doing. Because while it may seem jokey to have you've won the tutorial as an achievement, but if 70% of your people who bought your game didn't get that achievement, something went terribly wrong with how you design your tutorials and your onboarding. But I think with that, let's get to the game that I really wanted to check out, and that is Batman Arkham Asylum. And I will reset our little grades here really fast. While I'm doing this, how many people here have finished Batman Arkham Asylum? There we go. But let's talk about this one. Arkham Asylum, I think, is a very important game, as not only did it really begin this trend of seeing licensed IPs getting, I think, a lot of the respect that they deserve, but this was the watershed moment for Rocksteady. And I believe Rocksteady previously was known for making a very generic, gritty 3D Final Fight game. And this is what we've talked about on many of our Sunday shows with Shark, as well as a lot of the videos here, in terms of having that studio-defining game. That one title that elevates your studio to the point that it becomes its own marketing machine, whether it's Darkest Dungeon with Red Hook, Stardew Valley with, Chucklefish? Or, I forget the actual name of his studio. What are some other examples? Minecraft, Kerbal Space Program, Celeste, and the list goes on. But when we talk about one of the biggest games of the last decade, the Arkham series definitely kind of fits into this, because nobody was really expecting Arkham Asylum to be as good as it was. For those of you who don't remember, like, the majority of the Batman games were on the crappy side. The original NES one was really good, a few of the beat-em-ups. There is a Batman game based off of the animated series. I think this was for the N64 or GameCube. That turned out alright. But for the most part... all these things are popping up. But for the most part, these games typically weren't going to be massive sellers. And for me in particular, I remember the first time that I played the demo for Arkham Asylum, it was just the combat system. And I was like, okay, they may have something here. And then we tried the Alpha Predator stealth system, or the Invisible Predator, its trademark right here, and it worked out really well. Now this one, I know it has to have achievements based on progression. I can see them right here, so we can certainly take a look and see where people stopped. I'm expecting this to have at least higher clear rates than some of the other games we've played, simply built off of the Batman IP alone. So as we can see, though, very shockingly, a lot of people did not want to be Batman. And it lost 30% of the fan base, I think, pretty much at the first fight of the game. Because you're going to probably get a 5 times free flow combo within the first battle or the first 2 fights alone. So a lot of people did not like Batman Arkham Asylum, or at least didn't really want to learn it. And that is very surprising. It's not, completely unknown to us or, shocking, as we've seen games where 20 to 30% of the people who bought it stopped playing within, 10 to 15 minutes of playing. But as we can see right here, we go from 72 to 67. And 67 being, this is the first Joker, a Titan Joker kind of a clown fight. Rescue the guards from the Joker toxin. this one is when we get to some of the platforming of Batman. And the platforming in the first Batman game is very rigid, as you can only grapple up to specific points, and using the gliding system wasn't really as involved as it would become in Arkham City and Arkham Knight, when you can kind of do like pilot wings, like dives and like ascends with Batman. But we could argue that when it comes to kind of the main game of Batman, it really doesn't begin until after you escape the intensive treatment section, as the first area pretty much gives you everything that you need to know about what the game is going to be. You have the general combat, you have stealth, and you have the kind of quote-unquote mini boss fights and platforming. So if we go by this, the game appears to stabilize at 57%. Because we go from 57 to then 53. But even with that said, though, these two achievements are kind of out of the way. So if we were to be fair in terms of progression, it would actually stabilize at 49. Because these two, mostly you're going to just be doing them casually on your own, while this is the one that's in the next area. And it's kind of a shame that so few people actually got to see the Scarecrow's fear section. So we go by this, we round that down to 49%. Which gives us a churn rate of 51. Which is unfortunately high, considering the pedigree of the game and how well it did critically and commercially. So we keep going down. The Bane fight is the official first boss. And as you can see, not a lot of people kind of quit the game after the Bane fight. And the boss fights in the Arkham series are unfortunately infamous for not being the best fights. And I wonder if that Bane fight occurred earlier in the game, if there would be more churn as a result of it. Because it is just very much a fixed pattern fight, repeat the same thing again and again, and then Bane goes down. So we go from there to the second Scarecrow fight. Save Dr. Young. That I think occurs about a quarter to halfway through. There's not even really a battle with Harley Quinn. She just shows up with a bunch of goons and you beat them up. But as you can see, we're having very consistent levels of churn. And this is, again, what we want to see. I remember the Poison Ivy fight being a massive pain on my first playthrough of this game. But, again, once you've made it this far, you're going to see the game all the way through to the end. Then we have our clear rate. We're going to go by at least easy difficulty, because that is what at least the majority of the fan base went through. But I believe this is one of those games, if you beat it on normal, you get the easy achievement as well. So we have a clear rate of 31%. So we come over here. And what's going to be very surprising to me is that it seems like Tomb Raider, at least among its fan base, is going to beat Batman. So, 31 divided by 49 times 100. 63%. Yep, so, again, it seems that despite having way noticeable churn in terms of the initial start of Tomb Raider, more people picked it up, and there's a truck decided to drive past my window. There we go. Hopefully they're not doing any kind of work outside. But as I was saying, Tomb Raider certainly had noticeable churn, as you can see right here, losing over 40% very early on. Now, the problem with Tomb Raider is that without having actual progression-based achievements, it kind of stops us from seeing where did people just decide to quit the game. With Batman, we can see that within about 20 minutes of playing, that they lost probably a good 30% of their fan base. And this is what we talk about in terms of churn rate and core base. Because the churn rate, these are the people that you cannot really accurately rely on to be future fans of your games. Because if somebody's going to stop playing your game within 20 minutes, mostly they're not going to be first in line to buy your next game or the one after that. And then as we keep going down, what's very important, I think, to take note of with Arkham Asylum is the Born Free achievement. Because like we said, this is kind of where, quote-unquote, the real Dark Souls begins. By this point in the game, and this is what we would say, 40 minutes, maybe under an hour in, that you've seen the entirety of the core gameplay loop of Arkham Asylum. You've been introduced to all the major systems, stealth, combat, platforming, you know what the stakes are, and at this point, this is where we've lost 43% of the people who bought the game. And losing that number of people within about an hour or so of play is not good. What we do know, however, as a positive, is that once we've gone past the churn, and that would be right here, that people stuck with this game. They wanted to see Batman Arkham Asylum all the way through. But the lessons I think Rocksteady had to take note of is getting people to that point. And in a way, we kind of saw them learn from these mistakes with Arkham City and I believe with Arkham Knight. Both games have far more punchier intros. If you remember with Arkham City, it basically begins, if you don't have the Catwoman DLC that is, with Bruce being arrested, getting beat up, thrown in, and getting the suit and being kind of let loose within like 10 to 15 minutes of starting Arkham City. And when we do review that one at some point, we'll see just where did the game stabilize in terms of its progression. But another thing, again, to take note, and I think this is something that Rocksteady kind of slipped up on, is that the boss fights have never really stood out. I think the ones that were at least somewhat memorable for me were the Arkham Origin ones. But even then, they weren't really done by Rocksteady. They were done by another studio. So my question for everyone is that, what was the most memorable boss in all the Arkham games for you? And I mean, I can answer my own question. That would be the Mr. Freeze fight. That one was my all-time favorite because of it being kind of a pseudo-stealth fight. But for the most part, the bosses in these games have never been really memorable. And what we see here is that there isn't huge churn at these bosses. Again, we go from 45 to 44. We go from 33 to 32, 32 to 31. So that is normal. So despite the boss fights being annoying, they didn't really stop people from playing the game. Because again, once we kind of get to the core group, or the core base, these are the people who are going to stick with your game for the most part, unless something is just so completely horrible or they literally don't have the time for it. And again, as we keep going down, I wonder how many people got 100%. It's going to be very low, I'm sure. These are the Predator challenges, achieve. 2.8% actually 100% Batman Arkham Asylum. I think I may have 100%ed this game back when I first played this on Xbox. Definitely not when I played this on PC. But again, you can see that when it comes to secondary modes and systems, a lot of the people who buy these games, I think, generally avoid them, or they don't feel as motivated to play them. The same thing we said with Doom Eternal single player versus multi, or Tomb Raider single versus multi as well. I'm surprised so few people actually beat this game on hard. I know I did. I did the masochism there for it. I do like how the free flow get no damage is actually higher than beating the game on hard. And as we can see with these achievements, despite so few people doing these Predator challenges and the bonus stuff, they still were a part of the later games. And again, we can see, and despite the fact that so few people actually did 100% of the regular challenges, they certainly made them more and more involved in terms of what you had to do in the second and third game. So here's a question for those of you watching this, probably most likely recorded at this point. But for those of you who did beat Arkham Asylum, did you eventually go on to beat all 3 games in the franchise? And the same goes for those who are watching who did play through Tomb Raider, which I probably should have said that in the recording for the Tomb Raider section. Because as we saw with Batman, they certainly changed the structure, going from 1 to 2 to 3. The first Arkham game, we could argue, is more action-adventure, maybe borderline Metroidvania, while the second and third games are just pure open world. Here's a wide space, go be Batman and beat up people in. And I think it kind of lost some of the structure going from 1 to 2, and then that became consistent from 2 to 3. But still, this was a studio-defining game for Rocksteady, and like we said, you could tell that Rocksteady were huge fans of Batman and of the whole IP. I loved when they had the little bios of all the characters, when did they appear in the comic series. Again, getting the major voice actors and actresses to voice everyone was a huge point. Again, if you say that Mark Hamill and Kevin Conroy are in your game, that will certainly drive people to play it. Especially, again, with Mark Hamill's Joker. Although I thought that Troy Baker didn't do too bad of a job in Arkham Origins. But I think that will do it. This is, again, a shortened one because of how little there was in Tomb Raider, and I'd like to have these to be on the shorter side. But in terms of lessons learned, for one thing, again, the intro of your game really does matter. You have to pay attention to the first 30 minutes to an hour of your game. Because as we've said, if your game has 80 hours of playtime, but people stop playing at 30 minutes, then you really only have a 30-minute game. It's something that I think Shark said on the last Safely Extreme cast as well. But again, we can see how much the game failed to retain people. Going down to 49%, just with the Doctor's Order, that is the second major kind of building that you explore in the game. But once they got past that point, people certainly stuck around to play through it. And again, there will always be churn the longer a game is. Because people, again, have lives and they don't have infinite time, unfortunately, to play a game. But even with that said, though, Batman Arkham Asylum was very much a interactable Batman the Animated Series episode come to life, or just a Batman movie come to life, and showing people that if you treat the IPs with the respect and the care to appeal to the fan base, while also just making a really solid game, that people will resonate with it. And as of right now, it sits at over 23,000 reviews. So it certainly did really well on Steam. But with that said, we're going to wrap up this week's show here. If you'd like to vote for future episodes, Patreon supporters on Game Wisdom will get access to that. You can do all the liking and subscribing from down below, as well as check out our Discord and Patreon. I try to do these shows every Tuesday around 4 ET live, and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where they are in science of games. Until next time, everybody, take care.